Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 25. A dog may be trained by the trailing or dragging of a dead cat or fox, and in case of necessity, a red herring, 3 or 4 miles, and then laying him on the scent. N. Cox, A Gentleman's Recreation, 1686. Having been recently at Long Melford with its constant luncheons, teas, and dinners, Kate was not anxious for another party so soon. But she was anxious to convey to Sir Charles the information she had learned from Betsy that morning, and to hear from him what he had learned about the stolen emeralds. When she and Bee returned from visiting Agnes after their encounter with Betsy at the church, she immediately submitted herself to Amelia for the tedious ritual of dressing for the garden party at Marston Manor. When she emerged, impatient with the maid's fussing but pleased with the result, she was wearing a grey silk dress with a lace cape over full sleeves caught at the breast by a red silk rose. She wore elbow-length grey gloves and a wide-brimmed, tulle-trimmed hat. Bee was simply dressed in a light shade of blue that exactly matched her eyes. "Do you think we will see Sir Charles?" Bee asked as she and Kate were handed into the carriage by Pocket. To Kate's pragmatic mind it had seemed silly to order the carriage for a 3-mile drive, but to have driven themselves would have offended the hostess. "I certainly hope so," Kate replied, settling her skirts with a rustle. "We have a little matter of murder to discuss with him, whether he wants to hear it or not." She glanced at Bee, whose face wore an anticipatory look. Remembering how Sir Charles had patronized her at their last meeting, muck things up indeed. Kate resolutely turned her eyes forward. If Bee liked the man, that was her business. Her own eagerness to see him had entirely to do with finding Sergeant Oliver's killer and helping Agnes out of her trouble. However fervently Sir Charles might wish her to stay out of it, he would simply have to listen. The garden of Marston Manor was laid out in the elegant French style, with velvety expanses of lawn bordered by formally trimmed hedges and brilliant flower beds. An ornate temple stood on one side, suggestive of aristocratic pastoral fantasies, and on the other was a latticed white pavilion sheltering elaborately decorated tables laden with ices, sandwiches, cakes, and drink. In a nearby rose-covered pergola, a small group of musicians played Mozart and Bach. Linen-draped tables were centered with the crystal bowls of flowers were scattered conveniently about so that guests could sit and sip champagne or seltzer or lemonade while they recovered from the exertion of strolling about in the gardens and of the shrubbery. Upon their arrival, Kate and Bee were immediately swept up by a bubbling, diamond-decked Eleanor. "I have been waiting especially to see you, my dears," she cried, embracing Kate and warmly pressing Bee's gloved hand. To Bee she said, "I hope you are finding more to interest you at Bishop's Keep than at Melford." To Kate she said in an enigmatic whisper, "Never mind about the emeralds, Kate. All has been explained, and I am absolutely mortified in my ignorance." "Ignorance?" Kate asked with great interest. "Of what? How was it all explained?" "It was explained by my brother," Eleanor said. Without waiting to hear the other questions that came to Kate's lips, she led them toward Lord and Lady Marston. They were stationed on the marble stairs that led from the upper gardens to the lower, surrounded by masses and pyramids of flowers in an exquisite profusion of perfect bloom, arranged in great vases that might have been stolen from the Arabian Nights. The Baron was a bluff, balding man whose ample girth and apple cheeks testified to his love of fine food and wine. Lady Marston was as brittle as porcelain, but rock-hard. Her aristocratic nose slightly beaked, her chin jutting, her grey eyes glinting. "Miss Audley, Mamma," Eleanor said, "and Miss Potter." Lady Marston smiled graciously and gave her hand to Bee, but to Kate she only inclined her head, withholding her glance. Kate detected a distinct coolness in the gesture and was puzzled. She had been invited to tea and to dinner at the Manor several times before Eleanor was married, and had exchanged easy pleasantries with Lady Henrietta on those occasions. Those conversations had been threaded through with Lady Henrietta's unthinking assumption of superiority, which Kate had noticed but had not bothered to resent, since it was so obviously bred into the woman. Today's response was haughtier and a lot more chilly, and Kate wondered what she had done to earn Lady Henrietta's disapproval. Under another circumstance, Kate might have asked Eleanor what was behind her mother's cool greeting, but there was no time for that now, for Eleanor whisked Kate and Bee away from the Baron and Baroness and trotted them around from one glittering cluster of guests to another, all extravagantly dressed and jewelled and gay. The Marstons had invited many of their society friends, and Kate found herself in the company of such notables as Sir Wharfa Williams, the founding genius of New Sandown Racecourse, and a special friend of the Baron's, to Louisa, the lively, amusing Duchess of Manchester, and to the charming, witty Lady Brooke, the Countess of Warwick, and, Eleanor whispered to Kate, the current mistress of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. To Kate's surprise, the Countess, whose handsome husband, Lord Brooke, was animatedly discussing politics with Lord Marston, was not only elegantly beautiful, but seemed to possess a brain beneath her elaborate confection of a hat. Kate was intrigued to learn that she was an elected trustee of the Warwick Board that governed the local workhouse, and that she proposed to take the prince on a tour of its awful wards. Eleanor raised her eyebrows when she learned that news. "I was not aware that the prince had an interest in such matters," she said delicately. The countess sighed and fluttered her ivory fan. "I fear you may be right, but that shall not excuse his majesty. I have vowed to do all in my power to make him see how wretched the poor really are." Kate stared at her, thinking how incongruous it was that those words should be spoken by a titled lady with half a dozen rings on her fingers, a rope of enormous pearls around her alabaster neck, and diamonds dripping from her pretty ears. But Lady Brooke herself seemed oblivious to any contradiction. She went on to chatter with enormous enthusiasm about her schemes for educating poor children, providing jobs, and improving housing. "There's a great deal of work to be done," she said, her voice ringing with passionate conviction. "People's minds must be changed, their hearts touched. People, that is, who have the power to make changes in the government." "That may prove difficult," Kate said quietly. "Society, in this country, and in America as well, has a habit of caring chiefly for its own." The Countess regarded her thoughtfully. "A perceptive remark, Miss Audley. You are exactly right, but that is why we need to make examples of those who care, and we need persons to carry the message." "I regret to interrupt your exhortations, Daisy," said Lord Brooke, coming up to place a hand under her elbow. "But you must leave off talking about your causes and come. You are wanted by Lady Henrietta." The Countess tossed her head. "We must speak of these things again, Miss Audley," she said with a bright smile, and went off with her husband. There might be some incongruity between the Countess's person and her message, Kate reflected as she watched her go, but her concern was decidedly genuine. Speaking with Lady Brooke was the high point of the party, however. It wasn't long before Kate was quite weary of the entire affair and just longed to sit down. "There's an empty table beside that holly bush," Bee pointed out. "We shall take it," Kate decided, thinking of her chief reason for coming to the party, "and see whether we can spy out Sir Charles." But just as Kate and Bee reached the table, they were waylaid by Bradford Marston, resplendent in black frock coat, grey trousers, pink satin waistcoat, silk hat, silver-topped walking stick. His blonde hair was combed smoothly back, his blonde moustache and side whiskers carefully groomed. His handsome face bore the impress of aristocracy, a man with a look of vitality, confidence, and the authority bestowed by fortune and family tradition. "Ah, Miss Audley," he bowed over Kate's hand with a flourish of feeling that was at odds with his mother's cool greeting. "It has been far too long since I've seen you, far too long," he repeated, engaging her eyes as well as her hand. "Miss Potter," Kate said, "may I present the Honourable Mr. Marston?" She withdrew her hand and gave in to a mischievous urge. "I must warn you, though," she added, "Mr. Marston has a passion for motor cars. If he has his way, we shall all be on wheels by the turn of the century." Bee raised her eyebrows. "I've only seen one motor car," she said. "It smelled of paraffin and made a great deal of noise." "To be sure," Bradford Marston said smoothly, "but those are minor engineering defects and will be conquered shortly. In a year or two it will be possible to ride in a motor car in ease and comfort." He turned to Kate and extended his arm with a courtly gesture. "I would be delighted, Miss Audley, if you and Miss Potter would walk with me through the gardens. My mother has engaged the best gardeners money can obtain to impress her guests. It would be a pity to waste their efforts." "Oh, please," Bee begged. "I would prefer to sit and be quiet." She turned. "Here is Sir Charles. Perhaps he will sit with me while the two of you walk." Miss Potter." Sir Charles, not nearly so elegantly attired as Bradford Marston, bowed in greeting. His eyes met Kate's and quickly moved away. "Miss Audley, good to see you." Bradford Marston took Kate's hand and placed it on his arm with a propriety air so swiftly and confidently that she could scarcely retrieve it without calling attention to herself. "Miss Audley and I were about to tour the gardens," he said. Charles's glance flicked to Kate, her hand on Bradford Marston's arm, and then to B. "Well then, Miss Potter, perhaps you will sit with me and tell me about your observations on lichens. You have not yet outlined your theory to me," he added, "and I am most curious." "Lichens," Mr. Marston said, and shook his head. He smiled at Kate. "It is best that we leave them to it, Miss Audley." Kate cleared her throat. "Perhaps before the afternoon is out we could talk briefly, Sir Charles," she said with the greater stiffness that she had originally intended. "I have some information to share with you." She turned away, wishing in spite of herself that she could stay and contribute an interesting remark or two about lichens instead. When Kate and Mr. Marston walked away, Beatrix took a frosty lemonade from a tray offered a livered footman and settled herself to enjoy a productive exchange of scientific ideas with Sir Charles. This was not their first conversation, for her uncle Henry Roscoe had seen to it that they were conveniently seated together whenever they happened to dine at his house, which of late had been once or twice a month. The most endearing thing about Sir Charles, she thought as she sipped her lemonade, was his unquestioning acceptance of her expertise in such odd corners of scientific inquiry as animal behavior and lichens as well. It was an acceptance she coveted, for making some recognized contributions to science was another of Beatrix's cherished desires, along with the hope of publishing her drawings and stories and using the earnings to escape from Bolton Gardens. But after some little conversation, she noticed that Sir Charles' attention was not entirely fixed upon their discussion. He was answering her eager questions in a rather absent-minded way, while his eyes followed Kate and Mr. Marston as they wandered through the gardens and finally disappeared into the temple on the other side of the lawn. She carried on for a few moments, but the course was clearly lost. "Sir Charles," she said at last, when he failed to answer a question the second time she asked it, "are you troubled by something?" He turned toward her. "Troubled? No, not at all. Miss Potter, why do you ask?" Beatrix had never considered herself brave, and she was fully aware of the strictures placed by social etiquette upon the discourse. But there were things that had to be said, prohibited or not. "I ask," she replied gently, "because you've been waiting for some minutes for Miss Audley and Mr. Marston to emerge from the temple." Sir Charles laughed a little. "Come now, Miss Potter, I hardly think—" "You are quite transparent, you know," Beatrix said, gaining courage. The redness that suffused his jaw showed her that she was in fact correct. "I must say," he began. She leaned forward. "Why haven't you told her?" He paused. "Because there isn't anything to tell," he said. Then he stopped, considering. When he spoke again, his tone was straightforward and direct. "That is a lie," he said. "I have not spoken because there are other claims on the lady's affections. They take precedence to mine." Beatrix had been about to drink from her glass. Now she set it down, surprised by his use of the plural. "Claims? Miss Audley has suitors other than Mr. Marston and yourself?" The sudden flicker of pain in Sir Charles' eyes raised him in Beatrix's esteem more than 1,000 scientific discourses might have done. He could deny his feelings to himself or hide them from others, but he obviously felt them very deeply. When he spoke, his voice was gruff. "She has not mentioned Edward Lakin." "Only in passing," Beatrix said. She frowned. "But we are not so intimate that we have shared all of our secrets." She looked up. "Please forgive me for probing," she said quickly. "I'm sure it's quite forward of me, but I only wish your happiness and hers. And forgive me when I say that I truly fail to see why you should take it upon yourself to decide which claim should be preferred. I've always understood that decision, Sir Charles, to be the prerogative of the lady." He turned his glass in his hands. He did not look at her, but Beatrix could sense his deep unhappiness. "The other gentlemen are close friends of mine." "I see." Bee picked up a pansy that had fallen from the crystal bowl. The delicate purple and yellow petals had always looked to her like children's faces, and she pressed it to her lips. "Yet I still feel that you must press your own claim." She glanced obliquely at him. "To be fair to the lady, that is to say. What if she should prefer you to the others? Sir Charles sat still for a moment, as if he were weighing what she had said. A shadow crossed his face, then his mouth lifted in a vague attempt at a smile, and he placed his hand over hers in a gesture of intimacy that both surprised and gratified me. Thank you, Miss Potter. With all my heart. I value your advice most highly, although I fear that it cannot alter my intention. I trust you will safeguard my secret. Hesitant, aware that she was transgressing the bounds of propriety, she tried once more. I cannot persuade you to declare yourself. His hand tightened over hers. You must promise not to speak of this to Miss Hartley. She pulled in her breath. Really, You must promise, Miss Potter. His voice was light, as if he were joking, but there was a sharp intent. The secret must remain between us, otherwise, not another confidence you will worm out of me. She sighed. Oh, very well, she said crossly. But thank you, he said, and a smile lighted the depth of his brown eyes. He raised her hand with a satisfied nod. Now, what were we saying about lichens? In the temple, Bradford Marston used his silver-topped walking stick to direct Kate's attention first to the splendid stained-glass windows, the work of William Morris from a Burne-Jones design, then to a richly detailed wainscoting, then to an antique marble cherub imported from Florence. But while she appreciated his commentary on the temple's art, her thoughts were with the couple they had left. She desperately wanted to talk to Sir Charles, and she was afraid he might leave before she returned. As quickly as she could, she made an excuse to go back. Of course, he said. He turned toward the door. But grant me one favor first, please. And what is that? His eyes were on hers. That you will allow me to call upon you in the next few days, Miss Hartley. Kate was not easily taken aback, but Mr. Marston's question caught her unprepared. The man seemed to be asking permission to court her, but that was impossible. As a prospective member of the peerage, he was obligated to make a choice that would please society, and while she enjoyed his friendship, he was not at all the kind of man she would consider marrying. On neither side, it was a match. To call, she repeated slowly, but Mr. Marston, my dear Miss Hartley. His smile was confident, self-assured, and almost, but not quite, surprised. I trust you do not object. She hesitated, even more sure and even more astonished at the thought that he meant to court her. Really, Mr. Marston, I don't think... A shadow darkened the door, and a cultivated voice said, Mrs. Hartley, Miss Marston, how nice to see you worshipping the gods of the garden. The speaker was Vicar Barfield Talbot, a stooped, leathery old man with a mane of silvery hair, a silver moustache, and an ebullient energy that belied his 70-plus years. He was carrying a champagne glass in one hand and a white lily in the other. He had obviously been enjoying both the refreshment table and the garden. Ah, Vicar, Bradford Marston said dryly. Good afternoon. He turned aside, but the vicar, a friend of Kate's, had more to say. It was several moments before she could manage to interrupt the old man's flow of words and pull herself and Mr. Marston away. As they left the temple, Mr. Marston put his hand under his elbow. Since you have no objection, I shall call, he said. Before Kate could reply, he added, The sooner the better, I think. I have business in London tomorrow. Shall we say the day after that? Kate nodded. She could hardly tell him here that she did not wish to be the subject of his attentions. She would have to tell him when he called. Or perhaps she was imagining the whole thing. Perhaps his call was purely a social visit. Perhaps he meant to bring Eleanor, although he had not mentioned doing so. Mr. Marston cleared his throat. There is another matter I wish to clarify with you, he said, somewhat stiffly. It has to do with something my sister told you, about my mother's emeralds. She mentioned to me that she had discovered them to be missing and feared them stolen, Kate acknowledged. This afternoon she told me she had been mistaken, but she did not explain. Yes, he said. He twirled his walking stick, not quite meeting her eyes. Well, you see, the clasp on the necklace was broken, and Mamma asked me to have it repaired for her while I was in London on business. I took it to a jeweller, and that's where it is. I will retrieve it tomorrow when I go up to London. The clasp might have well been broken, but why that necessitated the removal of the other pieces in the set. Still, if Eleanor was satisfied, she must be as well. and the matter clearly was not connected with the murder of Sergeant Oliver. "I see," Kate said quietly. "I'm most gratified to hear that it was merely a misunderstanding." Mr. Marston's voice was hearty and his eyes, he had turned them on her, guileless. "Nothing at all of consequence, I assure you," he said. "Poor Eleanor has suffered the pangs of self-reproach quite unnecessarily. And now, shall we join the others?" A moment later, Bradford Marston seated her at the table beside the holly bush. "I shall look forward to our conversation," he said meaningfully. He smiled at Bee and nodded to Sir Charles, and then walked jauntily away, turning his stick between the fingers of one hand. Kate was acutely aware that Bee and Sir Charles were watching her. "I'm pleased to see that you are still here," she said to Sir Charles. She coughed slightly to cover her embarrassment at Bradford Marston's last remark. "Mr. Marston and I were waylaid by the vicar and were gone rather longer than I had expected." Sir Charles signalled a footman and obtained a glass of lemonade for her. "I assume that the information you have for me has to do with Sergeant Oliver's murder," he said. There was a certain dryness in his tone, as if he were remembering that he had directed her to stay out of the matter entirely. Kate glanced at Bee. "You have not told him of our discovery." Bee shook her head. "We had something else to talk of. Anyway, I thought you wished to tell him." Kate leaned forward. "We have learned of a curious nocturnal activity at a place called Highfields Farm," she said, "about half a mile from Gallows Green, just above the river. Our informant is Betsy Oliver, who witnessed it." Sir Charles frowned. "Ah, yes, Betsy, an adventuresome child. One might expect her to rove about at night." His frown deepened. "What kind of activity?" "When?" "2 nights before the sergeant's murder," Kate replied. 5 men drove a wagon from Highfield's barn down to the river, where they removed a number of sacks from the wagon and onto a boat. According to Betsy, one of the men was called by the name of Juan. Another was called Mr. B, the familiar name, I'm told, of Mr. Gregor's brother-in-law, Tommy Brock. Betsy also described a third who sounds very much like Mr. Todd, a local bailiff, who organizes the crews that travel from farm to farm at harvest and planting time. "We thought they might be pirates," B put in excitedly, "or smugglers." "But smugglers usually move goods into the country," Sir Charles said, "to avoid the tariff." "Yes," Kate replied. "The question is, what were they doing? And what is the connection between their activity and the death of Sergeant Oliver?" "Precisely," Sir Charles said. "You expect that the poaching might be merely a device to divert attention from the real crime to something else, a red herring, as it were." Kate sipped her lemonade. "How did Constable Bradley come to discover the poaching equipment and the animals in the Oliver's shed?" "It was a tip, an unsigned letter." Sir Charles looked at Kate, his eyes intensely bright. "A red herring," he said thoughtfully. "Indeed, Miss Hartley, you could be right." "If I am," Kate reflected, "then it is of vital importance to discover the writer of the unsigned letter. Were you able to examine it?" "I was," Sir Charles said. "I was also able to make a copy." "A copy?" Bee clapped her hands. "How fortunate! It would seem, then, that we are pursuing the wrong quarry with this poaching business," Sir Charles said. "A quite different scheme is afoot, but I should tell you that the murder has nothing to do with stolen emeralds, which have turned out to be not stolen at all." "So I am informed," Kate said. She looked at him. "It seems that Mr. Marston has taken the necklace for repair. Is that your understanding?" Sir Charles coughed. "Something of that sort," he said. It was obvious to Kate that Sir Charles had a different idea about the emeralds, but she did not pursue it. "Well," she said, "if poachers are not a quarry, who is?" "I have not the slightest idea," Sir Charles said. "Perhaps you would agree to examine the copy of the letter Constable Bradley received and give me your opinion on the matter." Kate looked at him, her head to one side. Was it possible that he was actually taking her seriously? Then perhaps he would be willing to listen to her other ideas. "I would indeed, and there is an additional matter to consider. I wonder if you examined the sergeant's jacket, the one he was wearing when he was murdered." "Yes," he replied in a rather cursory way. "I recall that there was a small amount of grass seed intermingled with the dried blood on the front of the jacket, around the entry wound. There was no grass at the site where the body was found. It would appear that the sergeant fell face down onto a grassy area and lay in that position for some little while before he was moved." "Did you look into pockets?" Kate asked. "I did not." He looked at her. "I suppose from the tone of your voice that you have done. How did you come into possession of Artie's coat?" Agnes gave it to me, together with her husband's other clothing, to deliver to the vicar. I kept the coat, however, thinking that there might be more to learn from it. Perhaps if you were to examine the contents of the pockets under a microscope. Do you happen to have a microscope with you on this visit? He had mentioned at one point that he usually travelled with a microscope on hand. I do. Sir Charles pushed back his chair and stood. I shall dispatch Lawrence with a copy of the letter this evening, and he can fetch the coat to me. Thank you, Kate said, standing also, and feeling a deep satisfaction. She had come today feeling that she might have to force Sir Charles to listen to her ideas. She was leaving with the sense that he had not only heard them with respect, but welcomed and valued them highly. Bea got up. To Sir Charles she said oddly, "It has been a revealing afternoon." "Indeed." Sir Charles held her glance for a moment. "You'll remember your promise." "Yes," Bea said, nodding. But from the look on her face, Kate guessed that she was not pleased by the pledge which Sir Charles had extracted from her, whatever it was.